If you asked most Mexicans who they are, they would give you the same answer: indigenous blood, Spanish blood, and centuries of colonization fused into a mestizo nation. It is taught in schools, painted on murals, and repeated so often it feels like settled truth. The DNA says otherwise. Ancient genomes pulled from burial sites across Mexico, genetic data collected from millions of living people, and landmark studies published in Nature and Science over the last decade have rewritten that story from the ground up. What researchers found was not a simpler origin. It was an older, stranger, and far more human one than anyone had been told. Mexico was never just two things, and the proof has been sitting inside every Mexican alive today, waiting to be read. If this is the kind of history that changes how you see yourself, subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. For 500 years, the official story of Mexican identity followed a straightforward logic. In 1521, Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés defeated the Aztec Empire and colonized a vast civilization. What followed was 5 centuries of mixing between European settlers and the indigenous peoples they conquered, producing a new race, the mestizo, and with it a new national identity. By the time Mexico won its independence in 1821, this narrative had become foundational. Politicians built careers on it. Artists like Diego Rivera turned it into mythology. By the 20th century, the idea that Mexico was born from 2 parents, one indigenous and one Spanish, had become so embedded in national culture that questioning it felt almost unpatriotic. The problem with that story is not that it is entirely false, it is that it is radically incomplete. The Spanish who arrived in 1519 were not a single uniform people. Spain in the 16th century was itself a crossroads of centuries of conquest, expulsion, and migration. Moorish Arabs had ruled parts of the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 800 years before being expelled in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed. Jewish communities had lived across Spain for over 1,000 years before the Inquisition forced them to convert or flee. The people who boarded ships to the New World carried all of that history inside them, and their DNA reflects it. Beyond the Spanish, enslaved Africans began arriving in Mexico as early as 1519, just months after Cortés landed. By the 17th century, New Spain had imported more enslaved Africans than almost any other colony in the Americas. That history did not vanish. It went underground, and the DNA has now brought it back to the surface. If you want to keep going, hit like and subscribe so the next chapter finds you. In the coastal states of Guerrero, Veracruz, and Oaxaca, there are communities whose residents have dark skin, tightly coiled hair, and facial features that no one looking at them could mistake for indigenous or European. For generations, these communities were largely invisible in Mexico's national identity. They were not part of the mestizo myth. They were called Afro-Mexicanos, and for most of Mexican history, they were simply not counted. The 2020 Mexican National Census was the first in the country's history to formally count its Afro-Mexican population. The number it found was 2.5 million people who self-identified as Black or Afro-descendant. Genetic studies suggest the actual number of Mexicans with significant African ancestry is far higher, because African ancestry does not always announce itself visibly, and millions of Mexicans have never been told to look for it. A 2019 study published in the journal Current Biology analyzed genetic data from 800 Mexicans across the country and found African ancestry in every single region, including areas where Afro-Mexican communities are not visibly present. In some coastal populations, African ancestry accounted for more than 20% of the genome. The source was not recent immigration. It traced directly to the transatlantic slave trade, to the estimated 200,000 African men and women brought to New Spain between 1519 and 1650, a number that exceeded the total number of Spanish settlers who arrived in the same period. For the first century of colonial Mexico, there were more Africans in the country than Europeans. That fact was not taught in schools, it was not on the murals, and for millions of Mexicans today, the first time they have ever learned about it is through a DNA ancestry test that comes back with a percentage they were never prepared to explain. Before the Spanish arrived, before the Aztecs built Tenochtitlan, before any of the great empires rose and fell across Mesoamerica, the original inhabitants of what is now Mexico were not a single unified people. They never were. Recent ancient DNA studies have confirmed something that archaeologists long suspected but could never fully prove. The populations of pre-Columbian Mexico were genetically distinct from each other in ways that reflect thousands of years of separation, migration, and divergence. A 2020 study in the journal Science analyzed 49 ancient genomes from sites across Mexico spanning 10,000 years of prehistory. What it found dismantled one of the oldest assumptions in the field. The first humans to reach Mexico did not arrive as one group and spread evenly across the continent. Multiple distinct populations entered the Americas at different times, traveled different routes, and settled in ways that left lasting genetic signatures. The people of ancient Oaxaca were genetically different from the people of the central Mexican highlands. The coastal populations showed lineages that diverged thousands of years before the great civilizations emerged. When the Aztecs rose to power in the 14th century and began absorbing surrounding peoples into their empire, they were not unifying a single people. They were overlaying a political structure onto a population that was already genetically heterogeneous in ways even they did not fully understand. The Olmec, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Toltec, and the dozens of other civilizations that preceded and surrounded the Aztec world were not variations on a single theme. They were products of distinct histories, and their DNA shows it. The most surprising finding from modern Mexican genetic research is not African ancestry or ancient indigenous diversity. It is the ancestry that arrived from directions no one expected at all. The Manila Galleon trade route, which operated continuously between 1565 and 1815, connected the port of Acapulco on Mexico's Pacific coast to Manila in the Philippines. For 250 years, ships crossed the Pacific carrying silk, porcelain, and spices westward and silver eastward. They also carried people, Filipino sailors, Chinese merchants, Japanese craftsmen, and a population the Spanish colonial records called simply Los Chinos, arrived in Mexico in numbers large enough to form their own communities. By the early 17th century, the city of Puebla alone had an estimated 50,000 Asian residents. Genetic studies of populations in western Mexican coastal states have found East Asian and Southeast Asian ancestry that cannot be explained by any other historical source. The Converso connection is equally striking. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, tens of thousands of Jewish families converted to Catholicism to avoid expulsion, becoming known as conversos or derisively as marranos. Many of them emigrated to New Spain precisely to escape the reach of the Inquisition, which was less omnipresent in the colonies than in the motherland. In remote communities across northern Mexico, in parts of what are now Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, and Texas, researchers have documented families who maintained Jewish practices in secret for centuries, lighting candles on Friday evenings, avoiding pork, and observing fast days without ever explaining to their children why. Genetic testing of these communities has confirmed Sephardic Jewish ancestry. A 2018 study in the journal Human Genetics identified distinctly Sephardic Jewish markers in population clusters across northern Mexico. These were not people who thought of themselves as Jewish. Many had never heard the word Sephardic in their lives. The DNA remembered what the history books had been told to forget. When you put all of it together, a picture emerges that is nothing like the two-parent story Mexico was given. The average Mexican genome today carries indigenous ancestry from populations that were themselves genetically diverse and distinct from each other. Shaped by tens of thousands of years of migration across two continents, it carries European ancestry that includes not just Spanish, but Moorish, Jewish, and North African contributions filtered through a population that was already a crossroads before it ever crossed the Atlantic. It carries African ancestry from hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women whose contributions to Mexico were systematically erased from the national story for 5 centuries. And in specific regions, it carries traces of Asian ancestry and crypto-Jewish lineage that survived centuries of silence. None of this makes Mexican identity less real. It makes it more real, more ancient, and far more layered than any single myth could contain. The mestizo story was not a lie. It was an abbreviation, and abbreviations always leave things out. What ancient DNA research has done is hand back to millions of Mexicans the parts of their story that were abbreviated away. A woman in Veracruz who always wondered why her grandfather's features looked different from everyone else's now has a language for that difference. A family in Monterrey that kept old traditions they could not explain now has a history to attach them to. A community in Guerrero, whose identity was invisible on census forms for a century, now has genetic confirmation that they were always there. The DNA did not create these identities. It found them, preserved inside the bodies of people who were never told to look. Mexico was never one story. It was always dozens of stories layered on top of each other, some celebrated, some buried, some deliberately erased. Science is pulling them back to the surface one genome at a time. And what it is revealing is not a contradiction of Mexican identity, but its full depth. If this changed how you think about where you come from, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop your ancestry results in the comments if you have taken a DNA test.